Friends, good evening. I'm very happy that we are happy because I am participating in the third meeting of consecutive way here. And it is my fortune to introduce Professor Carson, Director of Martin Luther King Institute at Stanford University. I've been a professor of history. I've been an activist in the civil rights movement. And Stanford University is now compiling here in the Martin Luther King Institute entire works of Martin Luther King. Like what we have in India, the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi are very foundational reference volumes, which are in about 100. And these works are being brought out in about 14 volumes, of which 6 have already come. And he is a man with great concern for social justice, to build a humane society, and it had been my fortune to be associated with him. I came here more as a student to learn from him, because when I think of a better society based on peace and non-violence, when I look to Gandhi, I feel Gandhi is incomplete without King. So it is, what is that aspect that I should learn to make this knowledge more complete? That's why I'm here. It had been a very rewarding experience, very enlightening experience. Now I will present Professor Carson to you.
Thank you very much.
Just turn it on.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this will be a deeper voice. I want to thank my dear friend Prasad, I've come to see as a close friend across many miles when he goes back to India. But we never stay too far apart with technology, so it's really great to come here. And he told me about this group, and I've wanted to make contact with you. I think that we should have some kind of relationship. It's been my hope for many years to have a closer relationship with the Gandhian movement. I've had the pleasure of meeting several descendants of Mahatma Gandhi. Arun Gandhi came to the Institute just a few years ago, and I've met other individuals, and this has been very enriching for me as far as taking the King Institute in the direction I want it to go. One of the ways in which I could describe the way I view King is that he was a leader concerned with global social justice, peace with social justice, and I guess now we could say peace with social justice and a sustainable environment. Because I'm certain that if King had lived, he died in 1968, and the first Earth Day was 1969. So he did not see the beginning of that vast new movement to combine all of these concerns. And I think that part of what I see as a problem in the world is that we so often divide these concerns, so that we have people concerned with an better environment, but they seem to be unconcerned about social justice, or concerned about social justice to the point of even if it means violent revolution. So it's vitally important to begin to bring together all of these concerns and to do it on a global basis. So often we have this sense that these movements are national in scope. And one of the things I've learned over my lifetime is that we need to make connections across national boundaries. Last summer, I was in China, did my play, Passages of Martin Luther King. Very enthusiastic audiences in Beijing who were very interested, packed a theater for 5 nights where we staged acts of civil disobedience in Beijing. It was all on a stage, but it was a mile from Tiananmen Square, where those kinds of acts resulted in people dying. It was 18 years ago. And more recently, I was in Holland, and Belgium, and last year I taught in France. And there again, they're dealing with problems of social justice, with immigrants coming over from many countries, many of them Islamic, and trying to find ways of bringing together, building societies. And it's quite clear that something important is happening in the world in terms of an understanding what I would call the dilemma of democracy. And let me explain that. One of the ways in which you can view the 20th century is just think of this room. What were your ancestors doing in 1900? Just think of that. Many of my ancestors were peasants. They had no rights. They had no opportunity. The notion of going to a place like Stanford would have been as far away as Mars from them. If you look at the world in 1900, probably 85% of the world's population had no civil rights, no real citizens. They were colonized. They were discriminated against. Their greatest hope was maybe to get to a city and find a poor job in the city. At least it might be better than working in the agricultural economy. So that was the lot of 85% of the world's population. And in the course of that century, the first thing that's happened is that people have moved. They've in search of opportunity. They've come to America, they've come to Europe, they've come to the cities of all the world, trying to find opportunity. And also in the process of doing that, they've tried to gain political rights. They've tried to gain what we call equality, democratic rights, the right to vote. Just think of your ancestors, 1900. Did they have the right to vote? It's that simple right. That would have been beyond the imagining of most people in the world. So when I think of Gandhi, and when I think of King, I think of those great movements. It's not just these individuals, as remarkable as they are, but we wouldn't be talking about King, we wouldn't be talking about Gandhi if it were not for the great historic movements of the 20th century, which affected the majority of the world's population, that altered the lives and altered the world history. And we don't often think of it that way. I mean, just think of, I teach in the history department, and if I told my colleagues what was the great story of the 20th century, they would say World War I and World War II and the Cold War and all of these things. And none of them would mention this fundamental movement that changed the lives of the majority of humanity. And how did that take place? And we have some symbols of that, and that's where King and Gandhi, in my view, fit in. I often start my talks on Martin Luther King by saying, thank you, Rosa Parks. Because some of you realize that if Rosa Parks hadn't done what she did, that is, refused to give up her seat in a segregated bus, we wouldn't be talking about Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks made Martin Luther King possible, not the other way around. She didn't get on the bus and take her cell phone out of her purse and call Martin and say, what should I do now? She just did what she did, and that prepared the way for Martin Luther King. And so we need to understand all of these countless people, most of whom don't even get into the history books, the kind of footnotes of history, who helped us get from there to here, and will help us get from here to wherever we're going in the 22nd century. And what King and Gandhi can do is inspire them to think that they can do it too. That these momentous changes, just think of these changes just in the last 200 years. In all of human history, there's always been slavery. Every society, every civilized society, so-called, that was part of the definition of civilization. Yeah, we got slavery too. And imagine someone like Wilberforce, in the 19th century, who had the audacity to say, oh, yeah, I know we've always had slavery, but we're going to get rid of it. And imagine people in their lifetime taking part in a struggle that ended a system of oppression that had existed for thousands and thousands of years. And the same thing with, what happened in the 20th century in terms of rights. Some of you know from your history books, feudalism. What was that all about? That's the term that was used in Europe, but it really existed throughout the world. It was a hierarchical system. And you were born into the hierarchy. You were born with a place. And your children were born into the same place. And you never thought of rising too much above that place until we begin to see these great movements where someone decides, I'm not going to stay on this farm and be a serf and be a peasant. I'm going to go to the city and try to find some opportunity. And I'm going to try, why should I accept the divine right of kings? Why should I accept my place and just be a subordinate person in the society? Why can't I be equal? And again, the audacity of that, because no one had ever been equal before in the history of the world. In fact, that's what civilization meant, is that as soon as we got civilized, what it meant was a hierarchy. And it meant that certain people ruled and other people were the ruled. And the idea that somehow you could overcome that, the Jim Crow system in the South, colonialism, apartheid in South Africa. Imagine what it would be like if you were just here, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, the lifetime of many people who are still alive. They lived in a society, lived in a world where colonization was the rule. It wasn't the exception, it was the rule. That was the way most people who looked like me and most people who were not white, not European, that's how they lived. They were colonized. In the United States, we had this Jim Crow system. Whites at the top, blacks at the bottom. A system of discrimination, segregation. Same in South Africa. And somebody had to come along and just say, yeah, this doesn't have to be. Yes, England is the most powerful nation that the world has ever seen. Yeah. The sun never sets on the British Empire. Broke that kind of reality. So imagine Gandhi's audacity. He's saying, yeah, it's a pretty powerful empire, but I'm going to take it on. And we're going to take it on. And we're going to prevail. And the imagination and the vision to develop the tactics and the strategies to do that. And again, it's not just Gandhi. It's many people that we don't talk about. And the same with taking on the United States, the greatest empire of its time. When King started, the notion that somehow we would be in a situation, I think of this when I think of going to the March on Washington in 1963. And if someone had told me at the March on Washington and they'd said, guess what, in about maybe 11, 12 years, you'll be teaching at Stanford. It would have been like saying, you're going to be living on Mars. That would have been impossible to imagine. And yet, here we are. Similarly, some of you, you too young. You're such a young group here. But I was just thinking that, around 20 years ago, Lewis Jackson, he's old. He knows this. He's not really that old, but he's old enough to know about just 1985, 1986. If someone had said, guess what? Nelson Mandela is going to be president of South Africa. What are you smoking? It would have been, again, impossible to imagine, that kind of thing. Of Nelson Mandela sitting in a prison with a 30-year sentence over his head and saying, but I have a feeling that Nelson Mandela had a sense that that might actually be the case. But no one else would have. So that's what brings us here, to me. That's what brings me here. These are the movements of my lifetime. Some of you might not know this, but does anyone here know when the largest nonviolent protest ever in the history of Stanford happened? Anyone?
So that's 68?
1968? Okay, that's one guess. Anyone? You probably know. Believe it or not, 1985. And guess where it happened? Right in this building that we were in. 500 students were arrested right here in this building. Of course, it didn't look like this. It was a little bit of remodeling has happened here. And it was about divestment. It was part of the international campaign to end apartheid in South Africa. far more students, a far larger proportion, what is it, 500 students? That's a tenth of the student body of Stanford were arrested during the anti-apartheid movement. And this happened at colleges and universities across the nation. And so we had this international campaign to bring an end to the apartheid system that affected many, many countries. India. There was a movement to boycott South Africa so that it couldn't go to the Olympics. And India was one of the leading nations in terms of pushing that idea that no, you can come to the Olympics, but it's only when you bring a team that reflects South Africa that everyone can participate. And those kinds of things. Excuse me, is there some more?
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of things that, for me, are a part of the essentials of nonviolence. Just a little bit more about that. I have this idea about nonviolence, that the more people involved, the less each person has to do to achieve the result. You can see that with boycotts, for example. During the 1960s and 70s, the farm workers movement right here in California, how did they achieve their goal? How did they struggle? They asked people not to eat grapes. Boycott grapes. I remember, all I had to do was, for 10 years, not eat grapes. Now that was a sacrifice. But, I could eat strawberries, I could eat, all these other things. So for a long time, and right here on this campus, students refused to, if they served grapes in the dorms, they just wouldn't eat them. So after a while, they wouldn't serve them anymore. They would serve other things. And these are the kinds of things that lead me to think that one of the things that we need to do, and this gets to where the King Institute is and where we might work together, is that we first of all need to educate people about this. Sometimes we have this stereotype that nonviolence is about civil disobedience. It's about certain kinds of tactics that are associated with the 60s. And certainly that's true. I mean, there's always going to be room for protests and rallies and marches and things like that. But it's also just about communication. It's also just about telling people, if you do something, you can achieve a result. And sometimes that something can be very simple. It can be something that doesn't require a great deal of you, like a boycott. It might require you to simply know that if you do this, and enough people do it, it can make the world a better place. And right here in Silicon Valley, what do we have? The center of the greatest communication and communication technology revolution that the world has ever seen. We sit in the middle of Silicon Valley, which has connected the world as never before. And I guess this group doesn't need to be informed about that. I mean, India, of course, is at the heart of that revolution. And it has brought the world in many ways closer together, so that I can go home and talk to somebody through my computer in China or any place else, and they're, in fact, you go and look at my Facebook page, find people from all over the world, and who communicate on a regular basis. And it occurs to me that one of the things that we really need to think about doing is we sit in the middle of this revolution, and what is it being used for? It's being used to sell products. It's being used for pornography. It's being used for, all of these kinds of things, and it can be very effectively used for all of those things. But it can also be used for good purposes. And many of the students here, who have gone on to do great things. I was just over to watch the Y2E2 building that's just opened on this campus, and saw Jerry Yang and his wife, and he was here at Stanford just 10 years ago, and of course now he's a billionaire and able to use his wealth for some good purpose. And Google the same way, and what we see with Microsoft, and all of these people, young, eager to do something good in the world, but not quite clear what it is that's going to have an impact. But I think also with a sense that they have some answers to these problems of the world. And it's not just about making money. I mean, you can make money, but after a while, even for Bill Gates, it gets boring after a while. You want to do something with it. And it seems to me that one of the things that we can begin to do is use our imaginations, try to think of how we can use our position here, all of the advantages that we have. When I go to my office, I complain about the fact that we're in kind of the temporary buildings that have been here for 35 years, and Martin Luther King is kind of stuck over in what I call the projects of Stanford. We're across the street from the Y2E2 building, and it's it's a fine new building that's just been dedicated, and we're still in temporary buildings. But on the other hand, I say, my gosh, here I am, I'm running $1 million project. I might get the crumbs from the table, but they're mighty good crumbs at Stanford. And they're enabling me to do some wonderful work in terms of educating people about Martin Luther King and about the Gandhian tradition. And that maybe we can have an impact. Maybe we can use this place, this time, to begin to reach out to the rest of the world and say, we here at Stanford, we're here to learn some skills so we can get our careers started and do all of that kind of stuff. But we're also here to try to make a positive change in the world. And it's not that we're not going to get educated. In fact, the more educated you get, the more able you are to use that imagination, that creativity, not just trained to be an employee, but trained to be an entrepreneur, of using those skills creatively to have an impact on it. And to not forget that, of course, when, it's always, one of the things that it's almost like a joke over in the law school, all the people who enter law school wanting to be environmental lawyers and end up working for Exxon Mobil. But, that happens, and there's all that temptation, especially when you have all those debts that you built up here. But I think we can help each other think creatively to do that. One of the things that I've mentioned to several of you here is that because I'm a faculty member and because the Institute is supported by Stanford, if students come and say, we want to do some educational programs to spread the ideas of nonviolence into the schools, we can pay them to do it. We can, with Prasad and I are doing a class, and we're going to take 15 students to India to study Gandhian ideas next September. And Stanford is going to pay for the class. I mean, it's part, it's a regular class. The kinds of advantages you have here are so wonderful. And what I guess I'm urging you to do is just to think together creatively about how we might use the advantages we have here to do some wonderful work together. I think it's really a matter of the imagination, of just how we might think creatively. And I'm hoping that maybe there might be some collective project, perhaps having to do with the internet, where we can come together and use that communication medium to share ideas with other people in other campuses throughout the world. We've had a number of discussions about doing educational programs that could be, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a curriculum that was truly global? So that when young people who wanted to learn about how to build a world of peace and social justice and a sustainable environment, and understanding that all those things go together, that from grammar school through graduate school, wherever you are in the world, you would be learning similar kinds of concepts. So that when I go to South Africa, when I go to China, when I go to Holland, we have the same vocabulary. We understand one another. And we can then get back to that notion of, if there's some little thing that large numbers of people can do. Just think of Facebook, 200 million people. Just think of a Facebook that had something to do with not just getting to the next date, but changing the world, getting 200 million people to do something. Imagine that kind of influence. So that's really what I'd like to kind of put before you. I'm really open to all kinds of possibilities. As I said, for undergraduates, we have paid positions. There are ways of using the university to encourage it to move forward in lots of different ways. Those of you who might want to work together to develop something that is a technological innovation, you can actually get seed funding from the university. Believe it or not, that's how Yahoo got started, with seed funding from the university. So you can use this place and use the resources to do something very creative. So I promised myself I would not speak too long. I wanted to make this a dialogue rather than a monologue. So I'll just throw it open to questions, comments, criticisms, whatever. Please, why don't we stop here? Yes, and why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, and I'll ask other people to do that too. So.
I didn't anticipate that.
I hope it didn't embarrass you.
No, not I graduated in 2005. I'm an alum. And I work at Stanford now. And thank you for sharing your thoughts. That was very nice. I had a small question regarding if you could probably talk about the circumstances that Martin Luther King went through during his time period due to which he was able to reach the position he was. Because clearly there were a lot of people before him also, as you mentioned, Rosa Parks, and clearly lots of people much before him. And it seems to me that the circumstances at different points were very different. And I'm just curious about what was the confluence of things which led to him becoming such an important figure? And I know it's a large question, so.
Yeah, I think that the question about one of the ways Jack would phrase that question is that there were other people who did the same thing that Rosa Parks did maybe 10 years earlier or 20 years. In fact, Rosa Parks herself did the same thing. She had refused to give up her seat in a bus years earlier. Just months earlier, a young woman refused to do that. You know, most times what would happen is the person would challenge Jim Crow, police would be called, you'd be thrown into jail, and maybe no one would ever hear from you again. I mean, it's, so obviously, whenever you have an oppressive system, there's always going to be people challenging it. And that's the history of anti-colonial struggles, as you well know. I mean, in India, the long history going back 100 years before independence of people resisting the system. So the question always is, well, when does an act of resistance begin to have an impact? And, you know, what historians look at the historical moment, you know, of what are the broader social changes that were taking place. And one of the most important, of course, was World War II. One of the things that happens with war, especially wars where large numbers of non-white people go and fight on behalf of imperialist countries, is they come back home with a different perspective of the world. When Indian soldiers go and fight on behalf of England, well, when they come back, they have different expectations about their role in the society. My father landed in France in World War II and came back home with different expectations. He was able to move his family to the west. You know, he was decommissioned in Seattle, and we ended up in New Mexico, and he got a job as a security inspector at the Los Alamos laboratory. So rather than growing up in the inner city of Detroit or in a farm in Florida where my mother grew up, I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where I was able to go to nice schools, get certain educational advantages, and go off to UCLA to go to college. So those kinds of things were happening on a mass scale. Also, because the war was fought supposedly for democracy, you know, when Churchill and Roosevelt got together and issued the Atlantic Charter, what did they say the war was about? They said, oh, we're going to bring self-determination. Well, people were listening. I don't think Churchill meant that. And he kind of quickly corrected it and said, well, we don't really mean decolonization, at least not in my lifetime. Because he also said, I don't intend to be the prime minister who presides over the dissolution of the British Empire. But that's what happened. So all of those kinds of changes, urbanization. When you move to the city, it's harder to control people, as people throughout modern history have found out. It's harder to impose the kind of controls that you can in a rural or small town environment. So all of those changes were happening. One of the things that was true about the African American struggle is that it was basically an urban struggle until the 1960s, when it gradually moved into the what we call the Black Belt areas of Mississippi and Alabama. And there the resistance was most intense. And that's why it took longer for change to take place there. So those are the kinds of things, you know, if Martin Luther King had been born 10 years earlier, we probably would not be mentioning his name. You know, a lot of this is, it's not just the great person makes history. It's the great person at the right historical moment. You know, maybe there might have been someone with the courage and the vision of Martin Luther King, but they would have been beating their heads against the wall if they had come along 10 or 20 years earlier. So that's another thing we need to understand, and part of what vision is all about is what is possible at what historical moment. You know, what's possible at this historical moment? What you know, we look back now and you have to look in the history books to understand what colonization was all about, or what apartheid was all about, or what the Jim Crow system was all about. Ask yourself this: what in 50 or 60 or 70 years are they going to look in the history books back at our time and say, my gosh, how did those people put up with that? You know, is it going to be the idea of medical care? I mean, the notion that you have to actually pay or else you don't get treated? You know, or are they going to look back and say, God, that was a savage, you know, kind of idea? I mean, the notion that if you break your arm, you're going to have to go to this place and someone's going to ask you to pay for it to get fixed. You know, is that going to be kind of like the way we look at slavery today? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, that's really your generation's decision. But it'll be something like that, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about Dr. King's soul force? Did he hate the people he was protesting against? And if he didn't, how, I can't imagine this to have been something he was born with. How did he develop it?
He definitely wasn't born with it. In fact, one of the things that in the autobiography of Martin Luther King, which I edited, he says, you know, when he was a teenager, growing up, he said, I came to hate white people, just from what he saw. So it took a conscious effort to kind of overcome that. And that was part of his own education. It is a difficult process. I don't think, you know, we sometimes think that great people are just born that way. And it is, yeah, I mean, there are exceptional aspects of King or Gandhi. I mean, I think it has to do with character, it has to do with determination, but it also has to do with circumstance and educational experiences. You know, when he first heard about Gandhi, Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University, who had been to India, met with Gandhians, came back and gave lectures in the United States. One of probably a dozen or so African Americans who went to India during the Gandhi period and came back with stories about, oh boy, we should use these tactics. And when King heard it, he kind of dismissed it. He just, what is that all about? You know, it's not going to work. There's just no way that's going to be effective against the segregation system. So it took time for him to come to that conclusion. And I think it was really in the context of Montgomery that he finally said, yeah, this is going to work. This is, because I think what he said, he first thought it was, if you had the powerless going up against power, it just can't work. And it's only when he figured out that it's not about, it's just a different kind of power. It has power. But in a way it's a more effective power because it's an unexpected power. And you put the other side, you know, if you're the most powerful nation in the world, you're expecting somebody to respond to your power with a similar kind of power. And you're, you know, like, look at the United States. I mean, any country that went up against the military of the United States is crazy. if you just make a frontal assault on the United States, but one of the things that has happened in our lifetime is we've seen Vietnam defeated the United States. Afghanistan defeated the Soviet Union. How did that happen? I remember this cartoon that was in one of the newspapers, and it kind of had world history as kind of a tournament with going back to several hundred years, and all these countries fighting to get to the finals. And finally, it came down to the semifinals. It was the United States versus Vietnam, and the Soviet Union versus Afghanistan. And Vietnam and Afghanistan won, but they couldn't have the finals because they can't even reach each other. So it was just kind of a way of saying, that this is what we, the notion that you have power, but if you come at that power with a different approach, that power can't be applied. And that's what happens with nonviolence. And I think that's what he began to understand.
You talked about the notion of equality, and that at points in history that may have seen a new notion. But it's also true that every person is born into different circumstances, and they're born as different people. So there's an inherent inequality there. So could you give some clarity on what this notion of equality that you're doing?
Yeah, I think certainly, when we think of equality in a political sense, what we're talking about is equal treatment. That whatever the civil society is, you should be treated equally in that civil society, regardless of other kind of, your birth, your wealth, all of these. And that's the ideal that developed with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, all the revolutions, all the democratic revolutions. It was just, it certainly, and in fact, one of the things that when you look at the American Revolution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, part of the paradox of democratic freedom is that we use our equality to become unequal. Because what we really mean is equal opportunity. And so the first thing that someone does is they pursue happiness. And actually Jefferson's first word for that was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And he then broadened it and said, no, it's not just property, but that's part of it. But that's the thing, is that we use liberty and equality as a means to build a good life for ourselves. And part of the misconception, and it just leads to, that kind of, that equality is about making people the same, is that we understand that that's a different form of tyranny. Because to prevent that individualization of people, you have to keep them all down. And I think that we've always had this balancing of these two things. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's yeah, that's the way I answer it. Yes, please.
I have two questions.
If I can remember both parts.
They're very simple. The first part is, I'm a little bit familiar with King's work, but I'm not particularly familiar with his writings or his thoughts about where he saw black people in terms of politics. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that. Like, did he have a vision, like we have today, like incredible black men running for president? Was that ever in his vision? Did he ever talk about that? And I'd like to know personally from you how you personally feel today, considering where you've come from, being in that position where Barack Obama is running for president.
Yeah, I've given a lot of thought to that in recent times, because it does seem like another stage in this process of just the unimaginable things that happen. I think that King, to get to that part of the question, he was always concerned about political and economic rights. Probably placed the most importance on economic rights. But political rights was part of that, because you can't protect your economic rights unless you have political rights. And that's one thing that black people in the South learned very quickly, is that actually many of the race riots in the South were about attacks on, like the Tulsa race riot, which some of you may be familiar with, where it was an attack on there was a very successful black business community in Tulsa. And that was the target of the riot, so that business community was wiped out. The same thing happened in Memphis. So we understood that these two things had to go together, that you can't, that was the mistake of Booker T. Washington, of trying to isolate economic rights without political rights. As far as Obama, I think it's actually more complex than the fact that he's seen as an African-American leader. Because as you know, one of the points of his campaign is that he doesn't want to be seen that way. And it's interesting, I look upon King as something more than a black civil rights leader, which is the box that he's put into in the United States. To me, he's an American world leader. And when I leave the United States, it's easier for me to understand that, because on the streets of Beijing, if you want to know one historical American that they're likely to know, it's Martin Luther King. It's not John F. Kennedy. It's not Lyndon Johnson. Taylor Branch wrote a book about Martin Luther King, America in the King years. Imagine, if Lyndon Johnson had lived to find out that he was living in the King years. It would have been a complete shock to him, because he would have thought, gosh, that was the Johnson years. So I think that part of what is happening with the Obama campaign, and it's difficult, and you can see Americans just straining with this. They can't really get their minds around it. That he's a person who wants to be president who happens to have African ancestry. And that's just a difficult concept, because we live in a country where if you do go to the hospital, someone is going to say, what race is this person? And it's just so ingrained that, and for most of American history, it's been a dichotomous. It's black or white. And so I think for someone coming up like him, it's a process of education, and I'm not sure it's going to happen in this country. I think it might not happen. I think it's amazing he's got this far. But it's because every time he seems to be transcending that, it seems to come right back to that. And it's, of course Hillary faces the same issue. When will we be able to just vote for a candidate and not be concerned about whether she's a woman? I don't know. Not for a while. I mean, even many of the people who are voting for Obama or voting for Hillary are voting either for or against the notion of a black person or a woman. And and at least we've gotten past the point where whether Giuliani's a Catholic, which not that long ago, that was, we couldn't get past that. So it's, maybe we are gradually getting there, but it'll probably take another few decades. Maybe some of the young people are past there. I don't know. I mean, a lot of the young people I know have grown up with the King holiday. There was this poll that indicated that among kids in school, they were asked who were the most famous Americans ever. Martin Luther King was number one. So what does that suggest? I mean, more than Washington or Lincoln. Now, maybe what's happening is that generation kind of coming up where, whatever they feel about black people, Martin Luther King, he's like up there, so. Maybe that's happening with Obama too, that they can just look upon him and say, oh my gosh, he's a talented person and seems to be cool, and all of that sort of thing. I know that. I'm being interested, I mean, how do you feel about it?
Well, I'm a complete Obama. But I can't vote, so.
Yeah.
I think, I see him just like that. I look at him as a candidate and I think he's absolutely the best person for the job. Because I think for the first time since I can remember, I'm completely inspired by politics. I mean, I listen to the man and I feel compelled to go out there and make change. And that has nothing to do with him being black. It has everything to do with him being completely inspirational.
I absolutely know that if he did become president and he went on a tour of Europe and Africa, I don't know about Asia yet, but certainly if he went on a tour of Europe and Africa, there would be millions and millions of people out in the street to greet him. Because it's just like, they're so sick of what's been going on.
Right.
And it would be such a relief, now. I mean, it'll probably happen with Hillary too. I mean, if she becomes president. I mean, there's just so much of a sense that they don't like where America's been for the last 8 years. Yes.
So I wanted to go to the question that you started with,
What
which
can we
is,
do?
what can we do, and the education system in particular. And it's just this morning that I was talking to, maybe you shouldn't turn the camera off now, because I will reveal something which I don't want taped. So I was talking to a friend.
And to me, that's the more lasting one, because the money can. Okay, there's a limited number of good cars and big houses you can buy, and ultimately you're just as likely to end up on a shrink couch and be depressed and get your all the other things that go with upper middle class lifestyle. You're just as likely to get it as anyone else, unless there's some satisfaction in it that you're doing something worthwhile. So, that's where I think we need to work together.
So continuing on that, there have been some eye-opening studies in India on public education, and one thing that has been concluded remarkably, like every economist sees this, is that it's a complete failure. Failure because people will not send their children to schools that have been subsidized or free for everyone, but they would rather skip a meal and send their children to a private school, because they believe that in a private school the teachers take more efforts and they provide a better quality education. And this is being seen across the board, that beggars, in fact we had a finance minister of a state in India who came here and said, I'll beg more if you please help my child get admission in a private school.
Well, I beg to disagree with you on that. Most studies that have been done indicate that if you hold the class of the students constant, that is, if you're talking about poor kids going to a private school, public school, that isn't what makes the difference in terms of the outcome. That if anything, what makes the difference is several factors. Size of the school. Small schools tend to be more effective than large schools. In fact, it happens that many public schools are also very large. and also quality of teaching. And that could happen in a public school and a private school. What we need, maybe I can't speak for the situation in India, but I can say that if we're talking about the kind of the free market deciding education in the United States, it won't work. It won't work for a very good reason, and that is that ultimately, however you work it, if you use public subsidy for private school, all you're really doing is transferring public money to people who can then buy a more expensive private school, and that will price out those who, for example, if you took $8,000, which would be the average amount to pay for a public school education, you said, let's give $8,000 to every kid in California to go to school. Well, I can guarantee you that the average price of private schools will be $10,000 or $12,000. So somewhere somebody's got to come up with the additional money. For a middle class family, that's no problem because they're suddenly getting an $8,000 subsidy. For a poor kid, $8,000 is all they have. So what you're going to have is a very differentiated system of private school education in which the poor will be at the very bottom of it. But that's just my approach. We can have that discussion, and actually that is a discussion that's been going on for the last 20 years here.
My first response to that is, one of the things I'm learning about, especially from the experiments of Dr. Mohammed